13 hours GMT. Welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Valerie Sanderson. A new coronavirus vaccine is produced in Britain by Oxford University and the drugs firm AstraZeneca, which is highly effective, cheap to make and easy to store. A spokesman for the pharmaceutical company says,
"One of the real benefits of this vaccine is the fact that we can manufacture it at scale. It's a relatively easy vaccine to distribute around the world."
Reports from Israel suggest a new relationship is underway with Saudi Arabia. Lockdowns and disrupted economies because of COVID-19 have not stopped the rise in CO2 in the atmosphere, says the World Meteorological Organization. And the number of people infected by the coronavirus in the US soars past 12 million.
It's very worrisome, and it's also emotionally draining in itself to see that there's people out there not taking the precautions that we need, not taking this seriously still.
After this update.
Hello, I'm Aaron Safir with the BBC News. Oxford University says large-scale trials of its new vaccine against COVID-19 show it's highly effective and will save many lives. The vaccine is easy to store and transport and is cheap to produce. No one who had the jab, developed with the drug company AstraZeneca, needed to be hospitalised. Palab Ghosh reports.
This is the third set of results in as many weeks in which a vaccine has shown that it can stop people developing COVID-19 symptoms. At first sight, its figure of 70% protection may seem disappointing compared to the 95% figures announced earlier by Pfizer and Moderna. But it's still a highly effective vaccine, which has also been shown to be 90% effective if volunteers are given half a dose followed by a full dose. The researchers are puzzled as to why that's the case. The Oxford vaccine is made using a different technology to the other two and can be stored at normal fridge temperatures, so it'll be easier to deploy.
Israeli media say the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu secretly flew to Saudi Arabia on Sunday. He's reported to have met the kingdom's Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Tom Bateman reports from Jerusalem.
A private jet used by Mr. Netanyahu was tracked flying on Sunday to the Saudi megacity of Neom. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was meeting US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who has been on a tour of the region and who has helped broker historic deals to normalise ties between Israel and Arab states. Such a private meeting between the Saudi and Israeli leaders is of major significance. The countries have no formal diplomatic relations.
The former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has appeared in court in Paris at the start of his corruption trial. He's charged with trying to bribe a judge to give him inside information, which he denies. His former lawyer, Thierry Herzog, is also in the dock, but the judge, to whom he's alleged to have offered a plum job in Monaco, was too ill to appear, prompting calls for an adjournment. Overall levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have continued to rise despite a sharp drop in carbon emissions in the first half of the year because of coronavirus lockdowns. But the World Meteorological Organization says the rate of growth slowed a little. Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath reports.
When governments shut down their economies earlier this year, emissions of carbon dioxide from transport and industry declined dramatically. At the peak of restrictions, CO2 fell by 17% compared to the previous year. But this powerful warming gas can linger in the atmosphere for centuries. So concentrations in the air have continued to grow in 2020, building on record rises in recent decades.
Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath. World News from the BBC. Police in Uganda have said the number of people known to have died during opposition protests in Kampala and elsewhere last week has risen to 45. Local media quoted security sources as saying that most of the shooting was carried out by gunmen in plain clothes. A Belgian policeman who fired a shot that killed a 2-year-old Iraqi Kurdish girl has gone on trial for manslaughter in Mon, alongside 2 of the people smugglers he was trying to stop. His lawyer said the officer, who denies the charges, was devastated to have killed the girl, but was aiming for the tyres of the van which sped away from a police check. Police, who've spent more than a week trying to evict environmental activists from a camp in central Germany, say they're hunting a suspected saboteur after a treehouse fell onto officers. The officers below were unhurt. Campaigners are trying to stop road builders from felling part of the ancient Dannenröder forest. Scientists have warned that the habitat of one of Australia's best-known animals, the duck-billed platypus, has shrunk by almost a quarter over the past 3 decades. Researchers at the University of New South Wales are calling for the egg-laying mammal to be reclassified as a vulnerable species. Professor Richard Kingsford from the university said there was a danger the platypus could disappear if rivers kept being damaged by droughts and by dams.
This amazing animal is threatened by a whole range of different things, from land clearing to developing river systems and taking too much water out, and pollution. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. And if we don't get this right, then we're really in trouble in terms of biodiversity and responsibility to future generations for protecting these incredible animals.
Professor Richard Kingsford from the University of New South Wales. BBC News.
It's 13:06 GMT. You're listening to the newsroom on the World Service with Valerie Sanderson. They say all good things come in threes. First it was Pfizer-BioNTech, then Moderna. Now a third coronavirus vaccine has had positive results. The drug's manufacturer, AstraZeneca, in collaboration with Oxford University, says a large-scale trial has shown their vaccine to be 70% effective at preventing COVID-19. And for volunteers who received a half dose followed by a full dose, the effectiveness rose to 90%. AstraZeneca's Executive Vice President, Sir Many Pangalos, says it could play a significant role in tackling the pandemic.
I think one of the real benefits of this vaccine is the fact that we can manufacture it at scale. It's a relatively easy vaccine to distribute around the world. I hope that if the regulators deem the vaccine to be safe and effective, which they hope they will, we should be able to start immunising people in December.
So, is this good news for the developed world and the developing world? I asked our global health correspondent, Naomi Grimley.
That was always the big worry with the first 2 vaccines that we heard about announcing their final trial results, that they needed this special kind of storage. And of course, if you think of developing countries where you might be trying to get it out into remote villages, the worry was there just wasn't the freezer capacity. With this, it will be much easier. They'll actually be able to do what the UN's been trying to facilitate. They'll be able to borrow cold chain storage from the food and drink industry to get it where it needs to be. And so that's why, in some senses, this vaccine is much more democratic for the whole world. Also, another point to add, Oxford has done some deals with manufacturers around the world, for example, the Serum Institute in India, also another one in Brazil, to make sure that it can be made not just in the developed world.
Well, tell us about the results, because the headline is 70% effectiveness, which seems to be a lot less than the other vaccines at 95%. I mean, that seems to be disappointing.
Disappointing in one sense, but as we mentioned in your introduction, actually they did 2 different types of dose. So when they gave a half shot followed by a full shot, the results went up to 90%. Now that at the moment is limited data, and Oxford is clearly going to keep doing more tests on that. But that does suggest that actually the way it's given to people might have a massive difference. And they think this is because it mimics better the way our bodies naturally respond to a virus. So it almost primes our immune system better by doing it in a more sort of, in a slower, more gradual way.
And they're also saying, Naomi, that it appears to have an impact on asymptomatic transmission, not just on infection. So that's on people who are not expressing symptoms of the disease.
Exactly. And of course, that is key, because the big problem with this disease all along is it almost flies beneath the radar, that we might be infecting each other without actually feeling ill and deciding to stay home. And as you mentioned, the Oxford researchers think this is, again, another big headline in today's results, that it does have an impact on asymptomatic transmission. So not just preventing people getting really ill, going to hospital, but also preventing the infection in the first place.
Everybody listening to this will want to know, well, when are we going to be able to get it?
Well, of course, it depends whichever country you're in. In the UK, the government here has ordered 100 million doses of the vaccine already. Worldwide, AstraZeneca say they can make 3 billion in the next year, which is an awful lot. start. And then, as I mentioned, they've also done these deals with independent manufacturers to make much more. But of course, it will depend on whether you're in the kind of country which has, the right number of healthcare workers to administer it. Also, whether there will be that cold chain capacity to get it to more remote communities.
Naima Grimley. Saudi Arabia does not recognise Israel, but if Israeli media is to be believed, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has held secret talks with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Our correspondent Tom Bateman is in Jerusalem. I asked him what we know.
This actually started life with a tweet by an Israeli journalist at the newspaper Haaretz who follows aviation movements all over the Middle East. And he noticed that a private business jet frequently used by Mr. Netanyahu appeared to be flying to Saudi Arabia, to this planned megacity of Neom on the Red Sea coast. It's actually not far from Israel. I mean, you could drive it in an hour from the most southern point of Israel. So it sort of made sense. And Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, was there for talks with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on Sunday night, and the Israeli media now reporting that these secret talks took place between Mr. Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman.
Other Arab states have been normalising relations with Israel, haven't they? I'm thinking of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, even Sudan. But how important is Saudi Arabia in that?
Well, it would be the big one because it is the superpower, if you like, at one pole of the regional division between the Gulf states, including Saudi and Iran. And I think that is what is in the background to all of this, and that President Trump and his administration has been very keen to consolidate Israel with Arab states who are adversaries of and oppose Iran and the way that they see it operates in the region and see it very much as a threat. So it would be a big breakthrough to get a formalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But it was notable over the weekend, the Saudi foreign minister, in an interview on the sidelines of the G20 summit, which Saudi is hosting, said that they've made no secret of wanting normalization with Israel over the years, but he said it wouldn't happen until there was a full and comprehensive peace between Israel and the Palestinians.
Tom Bateman. And in the last few minutes, the Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, has posted on Twitter that only American and Saudi officials were present during the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to the Saudi city of Neom. So no mention there of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. FIFA, World Football's governing body, has banned the president of the Confederation of African Football, Ahmed Ahmed, from the game for 5 years. He's been accused of misappropriating funds and abusing his position. Well, our sports correspondent, Alex Capstick, joins us on the newsroom. Tell us more. What are the details of this then, Alex?
Well, this is the latest move by FIFA to tackle corruption within the organisation around the world. Not only was Ahmed Ahmed president of the Confederation of African Football, he was also a FIFA vice president. He was a former member of the Madagascan government and replaced CAF's longtime leader Issa Hayatou in 2017, supported then by FIFA's president Gianni Infantino, and was viewed as somebody who could change the way African football was governed, to lead it in a new scandal-free direction. But it's turned out rather differently. His reign blighted by a series of allegations of misconduct, and now FIFA, as you say, has found him guilty of abuse of office, misappropriation of funds, and offering gifts and other benefits. Among the irregularities, the financing of a pilgrimage to Mecca. His relationship with Infantino did sour last year on the eve of the Women's World Cup, when he was briefly detained by the French authorities in Paris and quizzed about a deal with a company called Tactical Steel, which was hired to provide equipment to CAF. It was odd because the company didn't appear to have any previous links to football, and it was relatively expensive. FIFA then sent a team led by Secretary General Fatma Samora to effectively run the organisation. Independent auditors were brought in. Their report detailed a whole list of questionable transactions, many of them paid in cash. It's been a hugely embarrassing saga and damaging for the Confederation of African Football. They've got elections in March, but Ahmed Ahmed, unless he appeals and is successful, he won't be part of that election.
Thanks, Alex. Alex Capstick there, and Aaron has the headlines this hour.
A coronavirus vaccine developed by Oxford University has proved highly effective in large-scale trials. A UN report says there's been an increase in the level of CO2 in the atmosphere this year, despite the COVID-19 lockdowns. Reports from Israel say the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has held secret talks in Saudi Arabia with the Crown Prince.
The global response to the COVID pandemic has barely dented the continuing rise in atmospheric concentrations of CO2, says the World Meteorological Organization. While carbon emissions fell dramatically in the first half of 2020 due to lockdowns, the overall level of the greenhouse gas, which persists in the atmosphere for centuries, continued to increase. Speaking at a virtual news conference, the head of the WMO, Petteri Talas, said the pandemic hadn't changed the overall picture.
COVID has led to a small drop in the emission growth. Since the lifetime of carbon dioxide is so long, we still measure the continued growth. And here you can see what has happened since the pre-industrial times, that we have enhanced the carbon dioxide concentration by about 150%, methane by more than 250%, and nitrous oxide by more than 100%. And we have seen also this year-to-year growth, which is not going in the right direction when we think of the impacts of climate change.
Well, on the line now is our environment correspondent, Matt McGrath. So are you surprised about this, Matt? And is it a disappointment to many people?
I think it will come as a disappointment to many people in some respects, Valerie, but it's not unexpected, and I think it's been well trailed that this is the likely outcome this year. As Petteri Talas was saying there, we've been adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere for well over 200 years now in terms of burning coal and oil and all the human activities that we do. About half of that carbon dioxide is absorbed by trees and the oceans, but the other half stays in the atmosphere and it can last for centuries. So each year when we add more to it, we are in fact creating a new record. We're adding more to it. So it's not unsurprising that we would have a new record this year when you consider that since 1990 we've increased the amount of total warming gases in the atmosphere by almost half. So it's gone up a lot. It's not unexpected that it would go up this year as well. They say there's been a slowdown in the rise, reflecting what's happened with countries in lockdown, etc. But that slowdown was so small, it was within essentially their margin of error. So, yes, I suppose you could say that it would be a disappointment, but the scientists would say this is a long-term situation. You need to look at this in the long term. And what has happened this year gives us some indication that you can bend the curve.
I suppose it also shows how huge the task is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question is, are countries going fast enough? And the answer from this evidence is that they're not. There's a bit of a bind here that countries find themselves in, because lots of people say, well, we should develop machines that can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's certainly true. But people worry that if you do that, then emissions will continue to go up and concentrations will go up. And this data shows that is still happening at the moment.
Matt McGrath. Now to Hong Kong, where 3 young pro-democracy campaigners have been remanded in custody after pleading guilty to encouraging a siege of police headquarters last year. This was the sound as prison vans left the court carrying the pro-democracy activists Joshua Wong, Ivan Lam and Agnes Chow. A few dozen supporters shouting for the activists' release as they were driven away to jail. Well, before the hearing, the 3 thanked their supporters and said they'd continue to fight for freedom in Hong Kong. Agnes Chow said she was worried about the future as she and the others could face years in jail.
I could be in jail for the first time in my life today or in the near future. Of course, I do feel anxious about the future and the upcoming verdict, but I hope everyone won't forget our friends who've sacrificed more than us.
Our Asia Pacific editor Michael Bristow told me more about what the 3 have been charged with.
These charges, which they've pleaded guilty to and which they face up to 3 years in prison, relate to a demonstration last year in June when protesters surrounded the police headquarters in Hong Kong. These 3 defendants have pleaded guilty to taking part and encouraging that particular protest. It looks like they're going to go to prison because they've already been remanded in custody. They'll be sentenced next week at a hearing.
And they are high profile, aren't they? But there are many other activists being detained at the moment.
They are high profile, but as you indicated, there's just many activists have been detained, not just young ones who have been a feature of protests in Hong Kong over recent years, but also some older activists such as Martin Lee, the lawyer. Also, there have been a number of arrests of other figures, legislators, local councillors, even media figures and journalists, not just under China's new national security law in Hong Kong, but under a range of other laws. The authorities have really looked to crack down on protests following the 7 months of sometimes violent demonstrations we had last year in Hong Kong.
So where does this leave the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong?
Well, it leaves it less than it was previously. Of course, if you put many of its leading activists in prison or you prosecute them, you tend to silence them somewhat. And many critics of the authorities in Hong Kong and Beijing would say that's exactly what they want to happen, to frighten people into staying quiet. Interestingly, Joshua Wong, before he went into court today, said prison bars wouldn't stop his activism. Of course, it will somewhat, and already we've seen in Hong Kong over the last few months, since the introduction of China's new national security law, people have remained a lot quieter. They haven't taken to the streets, they haven't protested, and so really the authorities over the last few months have been successful in curbing protest in Hong Kong.
Michael Bristow. The coronavirus pandemic has had an impact on our lives and also on our language. Use of words such as pandemic have soared this year. But COVID-19 isn't the only thing on people's lips, according to a newly published list. Well, the newsroom's Gareth Barlow joins me now. Tell us more about this then.
This is a list published by the Oxford English Dictionary. Normally they name just a single word of the year, but we've been doing so much talking in 2020, they've produced a list of them, and they have, unsurprisingly, majorly focused on the pandemic. So we've got COVID-19, WFH, or working from home, lockdown, support bubbles, key workers and furlough all make the list. But the unfortunate standout winner is pandemic. The use of that has risen 57,000% this year. And whilst we can maybe consider them as new words or new for us in our daily parlance, they actually have quite old rootage, some of them, as Fiona McPherson from the OED explains about social distancing.
That's not a new term. When we did our research on that, it actually goes back really quite far. But we've seen something like 20,000 times more in its usage this year, because that's something which we've all had to adapt to. And that's what's true about so many of these words. They're describing not only a phenomenon, but they're also describing the ways that we've had to adapt our lives.
And it's the same for coronavirus, for example. That's been used by medical and specialist people since the 1960s, but it's obviously soared this year. Although, interestingly, it's now reducing. People are saying COVID-19 more and more. We're getting more pissy during the pandemic.
And it's not just pandemic-related words that are making the list.
No, of course, whatever's in the news, therefore, has an impact on what we say and what makes the list. And US politics, for example, impeachment and acquittal when Donald Trump was facing those charges and investigations. And then in the election earlier this month, mail-in. With regards to the ballots, the use of mail-in increasing 3,000% on last year. And then more social issues coming into effect as well. Since the death of George Floyd in the United States, Black Lives Matter, or the abbreviation BLM, the hashtag that's used on social media, both of those have increased too. An interesting new word, one that I'd never heard of, anthropause. It's a new word that's describing the reduced human activity as a result of coronavirus, but then the subsequent positive kind of consequences of it. So less light pollution, less noise pollution, for example. And then the big one that's been captivating Europe for years now is, of course, Brexit. 2020, a key year for Brexit, lest we forget. Well, it seems as though we are forgetting ever so slightly, because the use of Brexit is down 80% on this time last year.
That's this week, though, Gareth.
That's this week. There's more time to go.
Thanks. That was Gareth there. And Aaron has some other stories from our news desk.
7 men, including a serving general, have gone on trial in France over the death of an Algerian-born officer cadet who drowned at a prestigious military school in an initiation ritual. They all deny manslaughter. Jalal Hami was 24 when he took part in the nighttime exercise at the school 8 years ago. The German Navy had to abort the search of a Turkish container ship suspected of smuggling arms to Libya. The frigate Hamburg had stopped the freighter about 100 miles north of Benghazi and sent a search commando on board. But the Turkish government quickly protested and the soldiers were called back before they could finish the operation. An activist in Singapore has appeared in court for staging a one-man protest in which he held up a piece of cardboard with a smiley face on it. Jolovan Wham raised the crudely drawn placard for just a few seconds near a police station in March in support of a previous protest by climate activists on the same spot. Mr. Wham has been charged with taking part in an unauthorised public gathering.
The United States is the country most affected by the coronavirus. More than 12 million people have been infected with it. The outgoing Trump administration maintains that America is more prepared than at any other time. But some health officials warn that the lack of a national plan and a mix of pandemic fatigue and misinformation is allowing the situation to spiral out of control. Our correspondent Neda Tawfik reports now on Nebraska, a state spared early in the crisis, but now experiencing one of the fastest outbreaks in the US.
2 floor preps, please. 2 floor preps, yeah. You're okay. I have 2 here.
At the Nebraska Medical Center, the team works to intubate another patient starved of oxygen due to COVID.
Do you guys have what you need for pressors?
Placing those in their care on ventilators is a treatment of last resort. But more and more here, the ill are losing the fight against the deadly virus. And nurses say never before have things been so dire.
I got it here.
We have, I think they said 10 COVID units, and one of those is just a place for people to go and pass away, unfortunately.
The fact that we've had to open multiple units so quickly is very concerning. This is nothing like I've ever seen or experienced.
More than 1,700 of Nebraska's healthcare providers signed a letter pleading with people to wear masks. Doctors Christopher Miller and Thomas Marston were the ones who wrote it.
It's very worrisome, and it's also emotionally draining in itself to see that there's people out there not taking the precautions that we need, not taking this seriously still. And we're seeing numbers rise at such a rate that there won't be a bed for you. There won't be someone to take care for you.
I just wonder, how much do you find yourself in a position of not just fighting this virus, but the misinformation around this virus?
I think it's emotionally exhausting to listen to the patients who come in and are bordering getting intubated and telling us that they don't believe in the virus. So it's kind of a scary thing to see.
Despite the current circumstances, the state's Republican Governor Pete Ricketts, who is an ally of President Trump, continues to reject the idea of a statewide mask mandate.
I don't think mask mandates are appropriate. I think that they breed resistance.
To the dismay of health professionals, some still view mask requirements as an infringement on their civil liberties. But in neighboring states such as North Dakota and Iowa, other Republican governors are now reversing course as the virus spreads rampantly.
Dear God, bless us for this happy gathering at this amazing time of the year. We are blessed to have our family all here.
The Fuscos are used to big gatherings like this past Christmas celebration. Across the country, COVID has devastated families, like this close-knit Italian-American one in New Jersey. Maria, along with more than a dozen relatives, contracted the virus, and 5 others died from it. She wants people to understand the ongoing risk and the heartbreak of losing loved ones that way.
I just didn't even know what was happening. I mean, to be in a hospital for 30 days fighting for my life, by the time me and my brother got up, they had already had the funeral. So there was no, to see them in the funeral home, to have that, vision that they are dead. It's really hard.
The strain on families has indeed been hard. Yet there's a fear that some Americans have grown numb to the staggering death toll and that the upcoming holiday season of joy could turn into a season of sorrow.
Neda Tawfik reporting. And the main news this hour, a coronavirus vaccine developed by Oxford University that's relatively cheap to make and easy to store has proved highly effective in large-scale trials. Much more on our website at bbc.com/news. But that's it from the newsroom for now.